I would like to introduce Egry Gábor. His institutional background, the History of Politics Institute. Perhaps it's not deep information or a very exact information our American and non-Hungarian friends, but you have to know that in this institute, which now led by Gábor, is one of the symbolical point of the contemporary Hungarian anti-fascism, since this institute is one of the place which would like to hosted out by the contemporary government. And as you heard sometimes in this conference, the contemporary government, one of the how can I say, the supporters, the positive memory of the pre-45 system. So I wouldn't like to say more about Gábor Egry, but I would like to ask him say his lecture.
Well, so thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for the possibility to present something at this conference. A bit of a patience I need from the audience. I will try to share a presentation, which is, yes. So,
yes, we see it.
Okay, so thank you. This is a conference on the Second World War, and I used to tour these conferences with a very similar presentation, so please forgive me for doing it. Recently, I have moved to study the First World War and its immediate aftermath. Nevertheless, I think that I hope to demonstrate also with this paper I'm giving today that sometimes it is possible to connect these two wars in unexpected ways, not just how they are usually connected by public intellectuals in public discourse or even by historians. The topic I try to outline very briefly today is how the Second World War and obviously the huge social transformations the Second World War directly caused within the society of a region in Eastern Europe, which is quite far from both the Netherlands and Spain. I'm trying to
It doesn't move.
to the next slide, and it doesn't work quite well. Okay, so yes, no.
Now
so,
it's okay.
Okay, so I hope you can see the region here. I'm sure that most of you have seen similar maps quite often. It is very typical to illustrate what happened to some of Hungary's territories at the end of the First World War. The intention is rather to highlight that there is a huge, more than 100,000 square kilometers large area that was annexed to Romania, and most of it, or around 60,000 kilometers, belonged to a historical, political and administrative entity, the former Principality and later Great Principality of Transylvania. And during the interwar years, this area was the home to something that is usually approached by historiography at a more cultural and intellectual level through intellectual history, history of cultural interactions, and that is called Transylvanism, a kind of regional identification that is supposed to express some commonalities of the three significant national groups, Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, who populated the area at that time. It was less associated with Jews as bearer of a specific Jewish culture, but they were not excluded as assimilated to one of these national groups. Another interesting issue that was taken up by historiography, and not just recently, but actually by more than 25 or around 25 years ago, most importantly by Irina Ligezeanu, is political regionalism within the titular nation that supposedly ruled interwar Romania among Romanians, and the political current within the Transylvanian Romanian elites that was reflected in certain political goals of devolution, soft autonomy, regional autonomy, and also in the political discourse, very much populated by elements that were othering in one way or another the Romanians outside of this region. What I'm trying to very briefly show today, so basically it's my argument, is again, I had some problems with the presentation, so I hope you will you will be patient, is another aspect of this regionalism. What I would say is a kind of everyday aspect of the regionalism, on using the analogy of everyday nationhood, everyday nationalism. Okay. How it was rooted within certain specificities of the society of the region that were also the legacies of its past in dualist Hungary and also within Austria-Hungary before the First World War. And how it underpinned that kind of political trends within Hungarian society, but also within Romanian society, that were labeled as regionalists, and how the changes affecting that kind of society actually contributed to the disappearance of the Transylvanism as a political idea, not necessarily in cultural terms. So what we can observe in interwar Romania, and in this sense, this retrospective perspective enables us to much better see how the society worked before the First World War, is a kind of common middle-class societal culture within the region that manifested itself most importantly in situations where the inhabitants of the region, irrespective of their nationality, interacted with people or groups coming from outside. Mainly in areas that are usually not associated with high culture, national culture, not considered to be the core of national culture, which is, I think, to a certain extent, self-explanatory. But nevertheless, it was strong enough to create a milieu that was unfamiliar for most people who were coming from outside the society of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Just to name a few of the most important aspects, especially the leisure activities and the new media were connected to this, with this kind of middle class, post-imperial, so to say, societal culture. For example, Hungarian operettas were quite popular, even among the Romanian middle class, Hungarian movies as well. Hungarian theatrical troops were touring the region with success, and their audience was not limited to the Hungarians living there, but also Romanians. At least, if one tries to assess the phenomenon on the basis of denunciations against Romanians who appeared on these events, it was quite frequent. And they also Hungarian radio was also very popular in the region, and not just again among Hungarians, but also among Romanians, as testified to by the number of radio permits, but also by such banal issues like which radio program was printed as the first one in the newspapers. That led to a kind of intervention of the state that wanted to change the typical order, the Budapest program being the first and the Bucharest program being the second, in a sense, very much showing how the Budapest was more interesting for the locals. But it was how it manifested itself, however, how this culture could have manifested some kind of subtle but very significant differences, and how it could have been used to pointedly or deliberately show these differences. Just one case, I use this example almost always, but I think it's a very telling story that happened in the year of 1932, when a few travelers from Bucharest spent their holiday in the mountain resort of Predeal over Brașov, Kronstadt, Brașov, and they descended to the city to enjoy city life for an afternoon. And when they entered the local Aro Hotel, which was also a kind of architectural landmark of the city, a new Bauhaus-like modernist building, what they encountered there was a crowd of locals, an interethnic crowd of locals, enjoying the music played by the band of the local military regiment, an allied unit of the Romanian army, a mountain regiment actually. And when they experienced that the military band of a Romanian regiment played a song which was familiar but also unfamiliar for them, so they knew the song. It was a famous song of a Hungarian operetta, 32-es Paka vagyok én. I'm a private in the 32nd Regiment, which was labeled as an irredentist song by the Romanian state security. They actually denounced the locals, the scene, the military band. It's not quite clear to the authorities as a group that have committed irredentist propaganda. And what we rather see here is the unfamiliarity of someone who came from Bucharest to a city where that kind of culture was still enjoyed in an interethnic setting. And no one really thought that just listening to this operetta song was the irredentist demonstration, could have been any kind of irredentist demonstration. It's also important to note that there were certain professional cultures among lawyers or judges that the locals felt being threatened by the extension of the rules and laws of the Old Kingdom to the area. And that was the sphere of life from where the political regionalism obviously was fueled, by which the political regionalism was obviously fueled. Nevertheless, it's quite important to see that such demonstrations of otherness, manifestations of otherness, were or could have been the signs of a deeper rooted regional identification, which was possible to mobilize for political purpose by the regionalists, and not just Romanian regionalists, but also by Hungarian regionalists as well, as we will see a bit later. So, but it was also characterized by a kind of extreme situationality. So it was easily used against Romanians from other parts of the country, but also against Hungarians who were still easy to characterize as former oppressors. So if one looks at the discursive aspects of this kind of regionalism, but also at such events as I try to use to illustrate the everyday aspect, it's fascinating to see how much people who were familiar with this milieu could use features like language use or the consumption of culture or the listening to the radio or whatever to recast the boundaries between groups and somehow bring together Transylvanians against whatever others were on the sea. However, in 1940, the northern part of the region was returned to Hungary, and it was the start of a process that actually undermined the social foundations of this kind of regionalism. The most important in this process was the practical expulsion of the Romanian middle class from the northern part of Transylvania, followed by and also caused by restrictive measures of the Hungarian government, which were reciprocated by the Romanian government against Hungarians living in the southern part of the region. That was accompanied by a mutual suspicion, and not just at the political level, but also at the social level, and also aggravated by the fact that in both countries, given that Hungary and Romania, nominally allies, were still looking at each other as potential enemies, the people were, in a certain sense, forced to by the propaganda, but also by the expectations of the state and society to modify their biographies and gloss over this kind of commonality, that the regionalism, that was the social basis of this regionalism. So Hungarians who wanted to have a job or whatever in northern Transylvania had to forget and never to tell about their commonalities with Romanians, and vice versa. Romanians were rather expected when they arrived to Romania, when they arrived to the southern part of the region, and when they were interrogated by the state organs about their experiences in northern Transylvania, to tell the most horrific stories. And the propaganda worked like propaganda used to work. So they used every opportunity to denigrate the other, to cast the situation both in the north and in the south as bad as it could be, or one could imagine. So the real ongoing persecution of both Hungarians and Romanians in the respective countries. And there was a political aspect of this process as well, not just the disintegration of the milieu of this middle class, the common milieu of this middle class, also what the refugees meant for Romania. They had a very important political weight within the country, even though General Ion Antonescu ruled Romania authoritarian way, and they offered symbolic capital for one of the most prominent Transylvanian politicians, who was also the symbolic figure of the opposition to authoritarianism in Romania, Iuliu Maniu. In the meantime, in the Hungarian part, in the north, a regionalist party emerged and became a kind of coalition partner for the Budapest government, which, however, although labeled itself as a Transylvanist regionalist party, Erdélyi Párt, that is the Hungarian name, so Transylvanian party, that's probably the best translation.
In 1940,
it was not regionalist in the sense as regionalism existed in the interwar years, but rather exchanged this regionalism for something what one can call subsidiaristic nationalism, so a form of nationalism which formulates and promotes nationalist goals, but also lays a claim on authenticity against the influence of the center, uses the idea that the own regional national group is much more authentic in national terms than the center is, and also claims to have the necessary expertise to handle the dangers arising from the region, what the center itself lacks. So very succinctly, this is the idea that the Romanians are a real danger for Hungarians, and the Romanians should be dealt with this way, so with basically with oppression. But nevertheless, it's not the task of the Budapest government to do it, because they don't know how to do it. They don't know the region. They don't know how to strengthen the Hungarians, but also what is really dangerous coming from the Romanians. It is the task of the local regional Hungarian elite to carry out that kind of policies, while the center has only one duty: to support unconditionally this local elite in their endeavor. So relent on political power, give as much autonomy for the local national elite to pursue these nationalist goals, which is probably easy to understand how it contributed again to the undermining of that kind of subtle and fine commonalities, social commonalities. The next step was the end of the war, when the Hungarian and the Romanian middle class suffered a kind of asymmetric fate. The Romanian middle class was relatively quickly brought to jail and imprisoned by the communist government, while the Hungarians served as a kind of allies of the Romanian communists in this endeavor, but enjoyed a certain autonomy, and their organization, the Hungarian Popular Association.
Gábor, you are close to your last minute.
Okay, I'm practically at the end of my presentation. Within this organization, the new Hungarian elite used the expertise of the old Hungarian middle class. For a few years, offered positions for this middle class within the organization, within this kind of national, personal national autonomy, so to say. And it came a few years later to the elimination, to a similar method of elimination of the Hungarian middle class. So by around 1950, both middle classes were eliminated in a sense, and the social basis of this everyday regionalism also disappeared with them. What came in the form of supposedly unified leftist communist workers' movement, and the new elite growing out of it was very different in the sense that they did not have the same traditions originating from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. They had something different, which defined the commonalities differently, and not focusing on the region, and also not focusing on this Austro-Hungarian and dualist Hungarian legacy. So, in lieu of conclusion, just very briefly, what I argue in this paper is that Transylvanism was more than just an intellectual dream or just a cultural idea. Its resilience was based on a social basis within the middle class that had that was also identical with the social basis of nation building, and that provided it with extreme flexibility. Under the strain, with the rise of radical nationalist mass movements in the 30s, the first cracks started to appear, but it still held. But with the Second World War and with the territorial changes, it was almost completely undermined, and the communist takeover and the sidelining or elimination of this traditional middle class was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. And that's the time for questions. Questions? Questions? Okay, if there is no other question, are you sure that the Transylvanism in any meaning ended? Because if you see the last 3-4 election in Romania, the cleavages in the Romanian political map absolutely the same. Where you see the old Romania, the so-called Regat, contra Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire supported, for example, in every district. That was the majority of the contemporary president. And on the Regat districts, every district supported his populist nationalist opposer. So up to now, Transylvanism, or that special tradition of that belonging to the West, it's a kind of issue in Transylvanians. Or if you see the mid-war cleavages, the national, that in that time that were two party, one that National Peasant Party and the other the Liberal Party. Okay, the National Peasant Party was not peasant and the Liberal Party was not liberal. It's okay, but the Liberal Party was supported by Regat and the National Peasant Party was supported by Transylvania. So that kind of deep things remained, perhaps an absolutely other cultural, but in some meaning that's belonging to the West, it somehow remained as a tradition of Transylvania.
Well, thank you. I agree that if you look at these issues, there is something that resembles that kind of regionalism. I still would be cautious to call it Transylvanism, at least in the sense as Transylvanism existed in the interwar years, or probably up to the end of the Second World War. And I have a few reasons to do it. The first one is that it's, to a certain extent, I think it's natural that over a certain size of a national group, these kind of subtle differences appear and people will become aware of the fact that they are not necessarily exactly the same as their co-nationals. And they make it clear or manifest it in the forms of jokes, swear words, negative stereotypes, whatever. But it's not necessarily, it's still not a political issue. The second, and this is pertains to the politics, that the Transylvanism was a relatively well-established political current, which my argument is more about its social foundations and why it was relatively successful in mobilizing people with these goals, while explicitly formulating some kind of regionalist agenda. And today, this kind of regionalist agenda is missing from politics. So what you can see is the different voting patterns, although they are, if you look at the maps of the last 3 or 4 elections, there are cracks in that wall running along the spine of the Carpathians. Some southern Transylvanian counties are now tending to vote more to the Passade, or so like Moldova. The southern Bukovina has completely disappeared from this map. It's like Moldova and not similar to Transylvania anymore. There is Bistrica-Neseud that is also sometimes voting irregularly by the standard of differences. So my argument is basically about the fact that this kind of deeply embedded social practices were fundamental for formulating a regionalist agenda, because they served as one of the not necessarily the means of mobilizing people, but one of the bases of the difference that made it easier for people to really recognize how much their world was different from the one the Old Kingdom Romanians or the Hungarians from Hungary, for that matter, represented. And this is, I think, really important. So I would say that what we see today is more the result of a few, but more maybe it's not necessarily the best term to use, ephemeral issues, more dispersed within society, and more connected to that kind of typical self-differentiations, what is also present in relations between Hungarians from northeastern Hungary and Zola, if you look at that one. So people recognize different dialects that they consider funny, whatever. The only issue that is, I think, certainly goes back to the interwar, and to a certain extent also to before the First World War, is the discursive aspect, that kind of civilizational differentiation which locates Transylvania at a higher civilizational level than the Old Kingdom. Practically, in its most, in its bluntest form, it claims that Transylvania is Central Europe and the Old Kingdom is the Balkans. So any influence from Old Kingdom Romania is just the Balkanization of the region.
Thank you. Perhaps some question appeared. No? One, two, three. Thank you for your lecture, Gábor. Thank you.